You are listening to Live from Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Kate Andrews, news editor at the IEA. The collapse and liquidation of the building firm Carillion, a company responsible for numerous government projects, has ignited a row over Britain's system of outsourcing public services. While the concept of these procurement contracts is nothing new, and indeed goes back hundreds of years, there is currently a cry for such projects to be taken back into state hands. Today I'm joined by the IEA's Head of Education, Dr. Steve Davies, to discuss the question of outsourcing and whether public services are best delivered in-house by government or through the private sector. We also examine the controversial Private Finance Initiative, or PFI contracts, and touch on the ways the government could reform its outsourcing structures for better outcomes. If you like what you hear, subscribe to our iTunes channel, IEA Conversations. Steve, private finance initiatives, or PFI, as they're more commonly known, are widely hated and despised, thought to be a terrible deal for the taxpayer, and a really crony system set up by government and big business. Is this an accurate reflection of PFIs at the moment? And can you tell us a bit about what they're actually supposed to do in theory if they're not doing it in practice?
Well, I'm afraid that there is a great deal in that, but it's not completely correct. Private finance initiatives, which were introduced originally by the major government but then massively expanded under Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor, really combine two things. One of these things I think is inappropriate, and it's right to complain about it. The other is appropriate, but is often mismanaged. Now, the first element is where the government wants to, let's say, build a hospital, build a school, but doesn't want to actually put the money up itself. Now, this was actually a major motive for Gordon Brown because he wanted to spend lots of money on things like schools, hospitals and the like, but he didn't want to have this showing up on the government's books as government spending. So instead, you have a deal where the money is actually stumped up by a private corporation, which then basically has a guaranteed return on the finance. Now, that part of the deal is really a bad deal for the taxpayer. There is no reason why major public construction and capital investment projects, for example, should be financed in that way by private funds raised through the private market, given that governments can borrow money for significantly less than any private actor can. And it was done purely because of the rules governing public accounting in this country, which are unique, by the way. Other European countries do not have these kind of public accounting rules. And because they make a distinction between capital spending and current spending, so that capital spending does not show up as the same kind of debt as current spending, which is a perfectly rational and sensible way of doing it. But rather than reform the public accounting rules, Gordon Brown did this. Now, the second aspect of PFI is where the actual project is done by the private sector. So instead of the government not only raising the finance, but also building the hospital or the school itself, the private sector, a private contractor like Carillion, for example, company in the news, of course, builds the school or the hospital. Now, this seems to me to be perfectly appropriate and probably a good deal for the taxpayer on the whole. The reason here is, of course, that, particularly with construction, you can never be sure that the project is going to go according to plan and is not going to run over budget, is not going to prove to have major problems which will cause huge cost overruns. Now, if the job is done in-house, all of the evidence is that problems of that kind are much more likely. The government, quite simply, is not very good at large-scale project management. And consequently, as we see from things like many defence procurement projects, many defence research projects, the Advanced Gas Reactor, the Concorde programme back in the 60s, lots and lots of other programmes, the likelihood is very high that there will be a significant cost overrun, which will then be borne by the taxpayer. Now, it makes perfect sense, once you've raised the finance through the public sector, to have the private sector actually contract to do the project, deliver the service, build the roads, build the bridges, build the hospitals and schools. The crucial point then becomes on what terms they do it and how you negotiate the contract with the private contractor, and that's down to the quality and extent of government procurement.
Because unless you think that the government has this comparative advantage of being a construction company, a cleaner, a caterer, and everything else, then some element of private sector provisions, keyword I think there being provisions, is helpful and useful and effective when it comes to providing services.
Yes, absolutely. And also not novel. I mean, using the private sector to finance government capital expenditure in particular is a novelty, but using the private sector to provide things like catering for the military, for example, in many cases, or other kinds of services, or build large contracts is not new at all. This has history going back hundreds of years. As I say, in that case, the real question is the degree of efficiency and competence in terms of the government's drawing up of the contracts with the private contractors and the degree and efficiency of the oversight that they exercise over those private contractors.
But of course, at the moment, we all think it's gone terribly wrong. Of course, this is because companies like Carillion have been a huge part of the news agenda with their collapse and liquidation. I mean, there are hundreds of companies that are in these contracts with government that aren't in the news and are actually running, we imagine, quite smoothly. But when it does go wrong, it goes wrong in quite an extreme way. So can you explain what's gone wrong with Carillion briefly, and also where perhaps we could have caught on sooner and maybe made some changes?
I think I have to say, with the specific case of Carillion, that you could write it up in a business management handbook as an example of quite a lot of the please don't do this rules for running a business.
What not to do.
Overextending borrowing, paying out large dividends when in fact the company was in a financially highly vulnerable situation, which is not what you should do. Taking on new projects and using the upfront payments for those new projects to meet bills on old outstanding projects, which is perilously close to being a Ponzi scheme, which is of course a criminal offence, I might add. So there were all kinds of faults in the business administration of Carillion. And these things, I'm afraid, happen all the time in the private sector. And of course, in the private sector, unlike the government sector, there's a penalty for doing this, which is that the company goes bust. And its shareholders and senior staff take the massive hit. Unfortunately, also, the suppliers take the hit. They're the often forgotten party in all this, people who have supplied the company that's then gone bankrupt. So there was definitely that going on. Now, in this and in a number of other cases, such as G4S security for the Olympics, for example, and some of the service contracts that Carillion had, contracts to provide school meals, for example, I think that there is evidence that the government didn't draw up the contract very well. This is what I was talking about earlier. In many cases, what you find is that the contract is drawn up in a manner which means that the private contractor is guaranteed all of the benefit, but not to bear any of the downside risks. And that simply is incompetent on the part of the government contract negotiators.
And also an antithesis to a free market.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot have a functioning free market economy without profit and loss. There has to be both. The whole point about a market economy is that market actors, companies, firms, businessmen and the like, they reap the profits when they get it right, but they also take the loss when they get it wrong. And unfortunately, a lot of the contracts in this area of outsourcing, as it's often called, have been drawn up in a way which privatises the profits but socialises the loss, so that the taxpayer is still on the hook for the loss, whereas the private shareholder of the private company reaps the benefit of any good work and profits. That clearly is wrong, but that's not wrong with the idea itself, and of course in many cases the contracts have been properly negotiated and properly set up. It's an example of incompetence in the government procurement process, rather than the idea of private supply of services and the like.
And what about the role of auditors, Steve? Because Carillion had several profit warnings last year. Shouldn't have all this been flagged up earlier, at least by the auditors, but probably by the government as well?
Well, you can perhaps excuse the politicians and civil servants in the sense that they do not know a lot about business. You could just about maybe make that kind of excuse, although you do wonder why, if the government is indeed procuring such large amounts of services, it doesn't actually have trained staff to do that. But let's pass that for the moment. But yes, I think that the auditors in this case, KPMG, should be facing some very serious questions. They passed the company accounts just 2 months before the first major profit warning in the middle of last year. And it was pretty clear, I think, from some of the details of the accounts that they passed, that the company was facing quite severe cash flow constraints. Now, this is in a business, the construction business, which is working on very, very tight profit margins. You're talking about a profit margin of about 3% or slightly more, not much more than that though, which means that if you don't manage your cash flow, you can get into really big trouble very, very quickly. Even worse than that, 70% of Carillion's value was intangible assets, and the great bulk of that intangible asset was goodwill. Now, goodwill is essentially the accountant's kind of estimate of how much the future income of the company should be taken into account in assessing its value. And so it's a way of explaining the gap between the book value of the company, its currently quoted value on the stock exchange or some other forum. And if you have strong reason to suspect, as I think the auditors did, that the future cash flow prospects for the company were not that rosy, then what you should do is write down the value of that goodwill, or impair it in the technical terms used by accountants. And they did not do this. They should also almost certainly have flagged up the fact that the company was going to make quite a significant dividend payment when all the books actually showed that it was actually short of ready cash. Now, that means I think that they do need to face some pretty serious questions, as indeed I believe they are, since they're going to be investigated.
There seems to be louder and louder cries now that all of these contracts should just be obliterated, that we should pay our way out of them or try to absolve them in some way, and that everything should be taken back to the government, because the idea is, I suppose, that it's more transparent and accountable than the private sector. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, and you don't necessarily agree with that. But when we have examples like Carillion being the poster child of PFIs, how do you go about illustrating to people that the process of, as you say, risk and reward in the market is arguably a more transparent one?
Well, I think you have to make the point about just how many major disasters there have been with in-house government provision over the years. The Department of Defence in particular has an enormous litany of major disasters over the year where colossal amounts of public money have been wasted. We can also think of things like the National Health Service's patient database, for example, which cost literally billions of pounds. And it's not clear at all that these are transparent. The Public Accounts Committee and other select committees of Parliament do the best job they can, I think it's fair to say, but they're almost inevitably playing a kind of game of catch-up. And the great problem with government doing a lot of the actual service delivery itself and the project management itself is that, as Milton Friedman famously said, in the case of government, what you have is people spending other people's money on other people, which is where you have the weakest incentives to get either value for money or to do it at a reasonable cost. Now, where I think people do have a right to be angry and to hold the government to account and to feel that basically the government and the taxpayer has been ripped off is with the whole procurement process. The way in which the contracts were drawn up, the way in which there was oversight exercised by the politicians of the government over the companies they'd given contracts to for running public services. That's where the reform needs to be. Talking about taking things back in-house is actually getting the wrong end of the stick and is not going to address the real problem. You will just have the additional problems I alluded to a moment ago. The thing to focus on, I think, is quite drastic reform of the way in which major government spending commitments, both capital and current, are done when there's use made of the private sector for good reasons to deliver those services. In other words, you need to reform the procurement process.
Do you think if we were to reform the process and we were to have PFIs that, had good contracts behind them and were working the way they were supposed to, that would be the ideal system for carrying out a lot of what the government promises to deliver? Do you think that's still operating in a paradigm you'd like to shift away from?
Well, it would be better than what we have now. If you did reform the system so that there was less, basically, as I say, socialising of losses and privatising of gains going on, that would certainly be an improvement, and it would be better, I think, than having the whole thing done in-house on the kind of basis that many of the critics of the current system would like to see it done, where government, for example, provides a lot of services with no real cost controls or for free. There is an arguable alternative, which is that governments, particularly local governments, should actually fund a lot of the services they provide through charges rather than paying for them out of taxation or borrowing. This was an idea which Arthur Selden, the long-time editorial director of the IEA, was very keen on. He wrote a whole book called Charge! Which was devoted to this topic. And there is an argument that for a whole range of, as I say, particularly local government services, that might actually be an alternative to both contracting these services out to private contractors or simply doing it through the direct works department, for example, of a local authority. I certainly think there's evidence that in the past that worked very well, because before the 1920s you had a lot of what was called municipal trading, where local authorities would run services like water works, tram works, gas works, house building projects and the like on a commercial basis like that, and facing the same incentives and penalties as the private sector, and did so quite efficiently. But that's just not on the agenda. This is hardly being mentioned. So if the choice is between taking these services completely back in-house, or having a reformed form of outsourcing where we have a tighter grip on the procurement process, I would definitely go with the second.
Thank you, Steve. For more blogs, podcasts, films, and reports, visit our website at iea.org.uk.